This is the Bell Books and Stories podcast with me, Richard Dykstra. Welcome. You're listening to the Bell Media podcast, where we take a look at some great books and the stories behind the books. In this episode, I'm speaking to best-selling author John Preston. John is a former arts editor of the Evening Standard and the Sunday Telegraph. He's possibly best known for his last book, A Very English Scandal, that told the story of the Jeremy Thorpe affair of the mid-1970s, and was, of course, made into a very successful award-winning TV series starring Hugh Grant and Ben Whishaw. Another of his books, The Dig, recounts the story behind the discovery of an Anglo-Saxon burial ship and associated treasures at Sutton Hoo in the summer of 1939, just before the outbreak of war. It's a find that has been described as probably the most impressive medieval grave discovery anywhere in Europe. A film based on the book, starring Ralph Fiennes and Carey Mulligan, was released recently on Netflix and is already tipped for awards. But he's here today to talk about his latest project, just published, Fall, The Mystery of Robert Maxwell. It's described as the jaw-dropping life story of notorious business tycoon Robert Maxwell. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much.
Right. Well, I mean, it really is an incredible story. So, it's war hero, sometimes spy, MP, associate of world leaders, successful businessman, media mogul, but ultimately a crook. I suspect most of our listeners have some knowledge of Robert Maxwell, but of course, it's actually about 30 years, in fact, 30 years this November, since the events that are the climax to your book. So perhaps it might be worth you just sketching out a little of Maxwell's background for those not quite so familiar with the story.
Yes, of course. I mean, one of the extraordinary things about Robert Maxwell is that it's hard to think of anyone really in the 20th century who journeyed as far from his origins as Maxwell did. He was born and brought up in a dirt poor town in the west of what was then Czechoslovakia. Town had a large Jewish population. Maxwell's family was Jewish. He left home aged about 15 to go and seek his fame and fortune. Three of his siblings, both his parents and his grandfather, all died in Auschwitz. And that's really the kind of prism that you have to look at Maxwell's life through. However badly he behaved in later life, there was this terrible tragedy pretty much at the start of his life. And although, as I said, Maxwell did journey an enormously long physical distance and social distance from his upbringing, the older and the richer he became, it was as if the past seemed to kind of dog his footsteps, almost mocking him for what he'd achieved.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting that you should say that. So, I mean, in terms of where he came from, that it seems that the war had both this issue about obviously what happened to his family, but also it seemed to be the spring for his whole business career.
Yes, I mean, that's certainly true. Maxwell came to England during the war. He changed his name 4 times by the time he was 23. And he chose the name Robert Maxwell, I think because he quite liked the sound being vaguely Scottish. And it didn't have any Jewish connotations. And he was extremely worried, with some reason, about anti-Semitism. And as a young man, Maxwell had dreamt of finding this commodity that would be in great demand after the war, which you could get for next to nothing. And one day, in 1946, he was in Berlin, he was running an Allied newspaper, and a man came in and said that he was the largest publisher of scientific journals in Germany, and could Maxwell help him? And Maxwell said no, and was about to kick him out, because that was basically what he said to everybody. And then he kind of got interested, and he asked the man to explain a bit more. And the man said that during the war, no scientific journals had been published, so he had a vast stockpile of stuff. And was Maxwell interested in doing something with it? And Maxwell basically realized that the commodity he'd been looking for all this time was knowledge. So he got all these scientific journals, translated them, sold them to libraries all over the world, and that became the cornerstone of his publishing empire.
Right. And the reason why he was in that position in Berlin was what? Because he was working with British intelligence, or what was it?
Yes, I mean, Maxwell had an astonishing facility for languages, and Berlin was at that time divided up into four zones. There was the British, the Russian, the American, and the French. Maxwell was one of the very few people who could move from zone to zone and pass himself off as a native wherever he was. So he was an enormous asset to British intelligence. So he did spy for them. And indeed, they actually set him up in business when he got this great cache of scientific journals over to London.
It's interesting that actually the relationship with Maxwell and post-war military intelligence was quite incredible, that it seemed that they saw something in him that they just couldn't, in a way, help but decide that they ought to, help finance, or even it looked as though they were, in some situations, that the connections that he had from his old military intelligence time then allowed him to raise money in the city. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, what you have to remember is that Maxwell was one of the very, very few Western businessmen doing business behind the Iron Curtain, as it were, and indeed, particularly in Russia. So, he was going back and forth, and I think he was very useful in that respect, because he loved to basically be the kind of conduit through which information would pass. And at what point he stopped being a paid up member of British intelligence is not entirely clear. I think he probably did carry on doing stuff for them on, as it were, a freelance basis throughout the 1950s, possibly beyond.
Yeah, and I suppose it's one of these things that you're never very sure whether he's doing the spying or whether he's being fed things that the UK perhaps is trying to put into the Russian view of the world or something like that.
Yeah, and I think the older Maxwell became, and the more successful he became, I mean, in many respects, Maxwell was far too much of an egomaniac to be a good spy. He had no real capacity for keeping secrets. So, they possibly realized after a bit that he may well have been more of a liability than anything else.
Right. I mean, one of the things which comes through, I think, in the book, as far as I'm concerned, is that you do seem to have a degree of sympathy with him as a character. But as you go through the story, and clearly, that it all ends terribly, really, and a lot of people affected by the fallout from it all. I mean, did you find yourself becoming more sympathetic or less as you sort of delve into the story?
Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, from the word go, I didn't want to judge him. I mean, of course, I realized that, you're an author, you can't be completely objective. But it seemed to me so many people had kind of pointed accusing fingers at Maxwell, often with ample reason. There was just not much point joining their ranks. I really just wanted to try to understand him. And although in many, many respects he was an ogre, he was a fascinating and in many ways really a tragic figure. And the older he became, the more the tragedy engulfed him.
I mean, one of the things then obviously is that in terms of business, he had a very large family, but really only two of the family, I think, were really actively involved. Is that right? Did you have much cooperation with them? That's Ian and Kevin.
Well, Kevin, none at all. Ian, I've known for years. I mean, Ian and I were actually at school together.
Right.
And I've seen him sporadically, but, fairly regularly over the years. And I said to him when I was thinking of doing the book, would he consider contributing? And I did make the point that I couldn't change people's perception of his father, nor did I particularly want to. But what I would try and do was humanize him. And I hope that I have done that. And in the wake of his death, I mean, Maxwell, 30 years on, is still regarded, if people regard him at all, as the kind of embodiment of corporate villainy. And it seemed to me that so much kind of black paint had been tipped over him that he turned into a kind of pantomime villain. And I just wanted to look at his nuances and his contradictions. And as I say, just try to make sense of him as a human being.
Yes, I mean, one of the things which seemed to be a kind of key driver of his story was this obsession really with trying to compete with Murdoch.
Yes, I mean, they were engaged in this extraordinary wrestling match for almost 30 years. And I think as far as Murdoch was concerned, Maxwell was just this kind of perpetual irritant that he could never quite manage to shrug off. And it infuriated Murdoch that his name and Maxwell's were always being mentioned in the same breath. And also the fact they shared the same initials kind of rubbed it in even more. But Maxwell, who kind of lost every round against Murdoch, became more and more obsessed by him and came to regard him as his nemesis, really. And indeed, it was in seeking to prove that he could go toe-to-toe with Murdoch that Maxwell set in train this chain of events that led to everything falling apart. His business falling apart and him falling apart as a man.
Yeah, so as far as I understand it, obviously they had some meetings before, but the real issue was that Maxwell always wanted to own a newspaper, but Murdoch seemed to beat him each time. That there was the News of the World, and then there was the Sun, and there was the Times. That each time he seemed to be outsmarted either by Murdoch or possibly by the shareholders of the selling organization.
Yeah, the irony also is that they were both of them, to some extent, outsiders. And Maxwell became convinced that the establishment was out to get him and that he would never be allowed to join their ranks. And he was right. But so what made it even more galling for him was that Murdoch, another outsider, was after a while warmly embraced by the same people that Maxwell had been trying to impress and ingratiate himself with.
Right, okay. I mean, one of the things that I realized when I started to go through all this was I was trying to place sort of events in history and things. And I suddenly realized that actually that he did succeed for a very short time in getting involved in a newspaper, a national newspaper, but only from a Scottish point of view. That
Yes.
He was involved with the Scottish Daily News, the kind of
absolutely.
workers' buyout or whatever in 1975. I was a student at the time, and actually I was involved with student broadcasting, and we actually covered that at one time. I have to say I didn't get an interview with Maxwell. It was one of the people that was involved in the committee.
I mean, in some respects, Maxwell kind of paved the way for what happened with Rupert Murdoch and Wapping and breaking the stranglehold of the unions. Because Maxwell, when he took over the Mirror in 1984, did make it much more profitable, and he basically imposed himself on the unions and forced through redundancies. And just possibly Murdoch might have kind of sat up and thought, hold on, well, if he's done it, I can do it times about 150, which is what he then did.
I mean, it was interesting that purchase of the Mirror was in 1984.
Yeah.
And he seemed to pay what seemed to me certainly a large amount for what was not necessarily a particularly profitable business at the time. But do you think that was the peak of the empire?
Maxwell buying the Mirror was a very, very good deal for him because along with all the various titles, he got a lot of property, prime London property. And indeed, the property itself was probably worth as much as the actual papers. The point where the rot really starts to set in, as far as Maxwell is concerned, is 4 years later in 1988, he buys for just ludicrous amount of money the American publishers Macmillan, and everybody implored him not to do it. And indeed, he ended up paying $1 billion more than the company's own directors thought it was worth. And the reason he did it was essentially because he wanted to take on Murdoch in what had become Murdoch's backyard, New York.
Yeah, I have to be successful in America, yes.
Yeah. And the trouble is, having forked out this vast amount of money and put himself terribly in debt by doing so, then there was a recession, interest rates soared. So from that moment on, he was frantically, as it were, robbing Peter to pay Paul to try and keep the empire afloat.
I mean, that's one of the things I realized when looking back in this all, that, interest rates were easily, base rate was 10%, never mind
Yeah,
anything else.
exactly.
Whereas, we've, for the last, 10 years here, we've been used to situations where base rate is under 1%.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
a
yeah.
very different commercial environment.
Yes, and of course, and Murdoch himself was in deep trouble at around the same time. I mean, this is a simplification, but Murdoch essentially went to the banks, opened up his books and said, I'm in trouble, but I think I can get out of it. Here's the situation. And the banks helped him. But the problem with Maxwell was he could never open up his books to the banks because he'd already been engaged in, what might loosely term extremely creative accountancy. So he was stuffed.
Yes, right. As you know, that I was involved to some extent as well with the Maxwell organization, but on the private side, on the cable and satellite TV side. Now, for understandable reasons, you don't really get involved too much in that because, most people understand the issues to do with the newspapers and things like that. But actually, in some of the things there, he was kind of going toe to toe with Murdoch, you could argue, and actually at the time probably ended up coming out the better of it in a way because he brought MTV to Europe.
Yep. Yeah.
And I was involved in the other side of that at the time because it was also a kind of tripartite thing between BT, because it was involved in the early stages of cable and satellite TV, Viacom, who owned MTV, and Maxwell. And ultimately, Maxwell sold his interests back to Viacom for what was actually a very substantial return.
Yes. And Maxwell, one has to remember, in many respects, was a brilliant businessman. I mean, let's just say hypothetically, Maxwell had dropped dead in, say, 1960. He would have been remembered as not only the world's largest publisher of scientific journals, but someone who had given scientists a platform to disseminate their views, and in doing so, paved the way for a lot of very significant discoveries in medicine, chemistry, biology, and so on. So, I mean, there is another side to Maxwell other than the kind of corporate villainy side.
Also, what I would say is that having come from my background into the organization, I had worked, say, with BT, and also I'd been involved in working out in Hong Kong with a joint venture out there with the Hutchison Group, which is controlled by Li Ka-shing, one of the richest Chinese entrepreneurs. And what really struck me was going into the Maxwell organization, how completely unstructured it seemed to be. That, this was at the last, I was there for, I suppose, just under 2 years, and there when the whole thing collapsed. But there seemed to be no ability for anybody to get logical decisions made because everything had to go through him.
Yeah, I'm sure that, yes.
Partly, as we now understand it, was because he was spinning the plates. But partly, I suspect it was also his kind of character was he had to be responsible for everything.
And he was profoundly mistrustful of other people, their abilities, their motives. So, yes, the only way he could feel safe was by doing everything himself. But of course, it got to the point where it was just simply impossible.
One of the things that you start the book with is really his attempt to buy the New York Daily News, which was really right at the end of things. Could you ever actually work out why he was trying to do that? I mean, it seemed to me that it was kind of the last thing you would do in that situation.
I think that by that stage, he kind of couldn't stop buying things. And you have this sense of him frantically reaching for this kind of indefinable something that's going to give him the satisfaction that he's always craved. And of course, he never quite gets there. But on a more sort of prosaic basis, Maxwell thought when he bought Macmillan's in 88 that it was going to give him huge public profile in America. But actually, it didn't really. I mean, it was a big company and, he was known in publishing as a big cheese. But outside that, people simply hadn't heard of him. Buying the New York Daily News was a much, much more high profile thing. I mean, you were kind of the uncrowned king of New York if you bought the New York Daily, because it was such a popular tabloid. And indeed, when he did buy it, there was, after this long, bitter strike, there's extraordinary scenes. People start dancing in the street. And, that the night that he's announced as being the new owner, he goes into the most fashionable Chinese restaurant in Manhattan, and all the diners stand up and give him an ovation. I mean, it's really amazing stuff. So he kind of got the veneration and respect that he had always wanted. The trouble is, by then, the cracks had widened to such a degree that it was kind of only going to end one way.
Right. And also the business itself wasn't really going to deliver in terms of financially. I think you said that circulation was slipping. I thought it was interesting that you also said that Donald Trump at one stage, a couple of years earlier, had actually tried to buy it as well.
Yeah, and I mean, in many respects, Maxwell was a kind of forerunner of Trump in terms of that crazed self-aggrandizement. I mean, Maxwell called his headquarters Maxwell House. The carpets on the floor had huge letter M's kind of specially woven into them. Yeah, and Trump had also had tried to buy the New York Daily News as a sort of launch pad for his political career, but in fact, he hadn't been able to, and indeed, he didn't actually have the money at the time. And so, yes, I think Trump was at that stage rather in awe of Maxwell and saw him possibly as representing something that Trump himself aspired to.
Interesting. Perhaps I shouldn't go too far exploring that. But I mean, one of the other things I think is, of course, interesting in the way that Maxwell seemed to behave was this inability to actually see separate bits of his business. That there seemed to be this idea that it was all just one thing, despite the fact that he had two public companies and a whole host of private companies. He seemed to quite happily duck and dive between them in terms of finances and things like this.
Well, I mean, what he wanted was, smoke screens behind which he could hide whatever he was up to. And that was one way of doing it, which is kind of blurring the line between the public side and the private side. And then on the very rare occasions people ever doubted that Maxwell, had quite as much money as he claimed to have, he would always say, well, look, I got billions salted away in Liechtenstein. And Liechtenstein, as you know, is a tax haven. And, nobody has access to any the information about the money you may or may not have stashed there. So, I mean, essentially, they took him at his word. And as it turned out, there had been money in Liechtenstein, but it had all gone by the time Maxwell went overboard in November 1991.
Right. I mean, another side of him is this issue about him being able to talk with world leaders and things like this. You do also see the whole kind of collapse of the Soviet Union was happening, obviously, at the end of the 80s. But he seemed to be very well connected with all these Eastern European prime ministers and presidents and things like this. And there's kind of a fascinating political dynamic in there.
Yeah, he'd published in the 70s and 80s, he published a series of extraordinarily laudatory books about various hardline communist leaders, praising them for their vision and humanitarian deeds, which of course they loved. And as far as Maxwell was doing it, it was just a kind of exercise in buttering them up so that he would be given more access to their markets. But, as we discussed before, he was one of the very, very few people who would shuttle back and forth between, Eastern European leaders. Mrs. Thatcher was then the prime minister, her successor, John Major. He was a very, very useful figure as far as they were concerned, because it flattered Maxwell's unquenchable vanity for him to pass these kind of tidbits of information back and forth. And he was a useful figure at a time when, there really were not many channels open. He controlled quite a few of them.
Yes, right. I mean, one of the things which I thought was interesting was this Maxwell-Gorbachev initiative. It seemed to be set up with great fanfare and really never seemed to go anywhere.
Maxwell had got kind of history in that respect because he'd famously bailed out the Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh I seem to remember, it was something like 86. And so he would promise enormous sums of money and would get the resultant publicity. And, everyone would write, Maxwell, jumped in to save the day yet again. But mysteriously, the money would never materialize, or, a lot less would materialize.
Yes, I remember actually that people telling me that they had all been given souvenir Commonwealth Games presentation packs, people working for Maxwell at the time. And the presentation packs included a £2 coin.
Yes.
And every one of them had the £2 coin removed.
Yeah, well, there you are. And so, yes, the Gorbachev-Maxwell was going to be a great initiative in America. And Gorbachev was very flattered by it. Maxwell had pledged, gazillions of dollars. But in the event, nothing came through. And by then, there was a lot less left in the pot than there had been.
Talking about, of course, what was left in the pot, a lot of it that eventually was keeping things going at the end was the money in the pension schemes.
Yeah.
Now, again, I have to declare an interest here that I am actually a member of one of the Maxwell schemes that was never really sorted out, and actually spent quite a bit of my time over the years as the kind of youngest member of that particular scheme, trying to lobby on behalf of the pensioners, but not getting too far, getting a lot of sympathy from MPs and lawyers, but having no real political traction in the thing, and that the government themselves obviously trying to kind of distance themselves from any responsibility. But one of the things that actually struck me with all of that is how much was going on there that the city must have known a little bit about.
Yeah, absolutely. But they chose to look the other way, and in many respects, they were as culpable as Maxwell. Yeah, I mean, they certainly deserved one another. And this was, of course, no consolation to mirror pensioners. But I think it's worth pointing out that Maxwell wasn't a kind of Bernie Madoff figure who was solely interested in lining his own pockets. He'd taken money out of the mirror pension funds before and paid it back. And actually, the legality of it was much more kind of fuzzy then than you might think. I strongly suspect that if he'd been in a position to do so, he would have paid the money back again. But of course, by then he wasn't.
I mean, certainly one of the things that again, you go back to this intelligence issue, that it was interesting that after the collapse, they brought on board a guy called Sir John Cockney.
Yes.
Who was responsible for organising sort of compromises in terms of various legal issues that were brought between the pension trustees and banks and things like this. But Sir John Cockney came from an MI5 background, didn't he?
Yes, that's true. Actually, you're absolutely right. I mean, yeah, it is one of those, you always feel with Maxwell that there were constantly kind of shadowy figures behind a curtain. And, it's very hard to work out exactly what Maxwell's links to Western intelligence were, because, inevitably they're under wraps. We know that he spied for the Czechs during the 1950s. He liked to keep up connections with his old chums in British intelligence. And, as I say, he was addicted to kind of myth making, and it all fed into, these kind of stories, some tall, some slightly less tall, that he spun about himself.
Just to conclude on things, are there any kind of stories that you just didn't have room to include, but you would really liked it. I mean, one of the ones I liked was just the reference to the fact that one of his early business partners was responsible for the fact that all the Chinese in the 50s and the 60s were all dressed in blue denim because they had misunderstood the order that they were asked for indigo.
What's weird about this book in a way is that when I wrote A Very English Scandal, I remember I would periodically find myself snorting with disbelief at various things that I'd turned up. And actually much the same thing happened with Maxwell. Because, of course, in one sense, he's like a kind of character from a comic opera. But there is this much, yes, tragic, but kind of sinister side to him as well. So, I just wanted, as far as it was possible, to give as kind of rounded a portrait of him as possible. I can't think of any particular stories that I left out. If they'd been that good, I probably wouldn't have left them out, is the short answer.
Okay, well, I would certainly say that it's been great talking to you, and it really is a fascinating subject and a great read.
Great, thank you very much.
The Fall is out now, published by Viking. John, thank you so much for being my guest on Books and Stories.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
And thank you for listening. Studio production was by Perrin Sledge, and I'm Richard Dykstra. There are lots of interesting podcasts in the Bell Books and Stories series, whether it's Kay talking to Helen Lederer about her book Losing It and her Comedy Women in Publishing Awards, or my conversation with Sue Flood. She's recently been announced as the winner of the Royal Photographic Society's Science Photographer of the Year Award in the Climate Change category, and she's talking to me about her beautiful book, Emperor, the Perfect Penguin, about her career and how, as someone from a small Welsh village, she managed to fulfill her girlhood ambition about working with David Attenborough. Hope you'll find time for a listen. And please also join us next time when Kay is exploring the role of the literary scout and how books end up on screen. Then again, John, you've probably got a few insights there too. In the meantime, bye for now.